Good afternoon and hello and welcome to everyone who are joining this webinar today. This is the second of 4 webinars dealing with the Higg BRM, the Brand and Retail Module. And today we will have a closer look at the environmental performance in the supply chain. And my name is Karen Ekberg, and I am the CEO and founder of Leadership and Sustainability. Sila, could you please move the slides? Thank you. And I have been working at Adidas for several years, responsible for environment. And now, since 2015, I'm managing leadership and sustainability. And we are supporting brands, retailers, and suppliers on their sustainability journey. And our main mission is really to improve performance in the sustainability area. And we have today, myself as a speaker, and then we also have Sila Yeshiliut as a speaker. And Sila, would you like to take it away, please?
Thank you, Karin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sıla Yeşilyurt. I recently joined the Leadership and Sustainability team as a Senior Sustainability Manager. Previously, I was leading sustainability projects at the Swedish fashion retail Lindex, and I have spent more than 10 years in the sustainability area. Thank you for joining us today. Let's have a brief look at how to use the GoToWebinar features. You are all on mute today in order to ensure audio quality. But you are welcome to send us your questions throughout this webinar. If you wish to do so, then please use the question function. The presentation will be available for download after the webinar, and it will also be possible to watch the recording. You will receive an email with the details a few days after the webinar. So let's get started. Here is our agenda for today. We will give you an overview of the questions in the Higg BRM brand section supply chain. After this, we will speak about risk assessment in the supply chain, building on the risk assessment method we talked about in our first webinar. And then we will talk about how to develop a sustainability strategy and the implementation. We will give you a brief information about leadership and sustainability, and finally, we will give you the opportunity to ask questions and discuss with us. The Higg BRM differentiates between retailers and brands. Today, we will focus on the questions that are applicable to the brand section, environment, and supply chain. The questions we will cover are established program for environmental performance in the supply chain, means of confirmation for suppliers, consultation of manufacturers, action plan, reduction of resource consumption, reduction and mitigation of risks, environmental performance improvement projects. And here, I would like to hand over to Karin.
Thank you so much. And let me continue. So I will just take over my screen here. And you should soon be able to see my screen. I hope that is the case.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. Thank you, Sila. So before we go to the actual question number 12, we will cover information about the environmental risk assessment in the supply chain. For those of you who joined our webinar number 1 yesterday, you are already a bit familiar with our materiality assessment methodology that we presented yesterday. And for those of you who didn't join, you will still get the full picture because we will be building on what we were talking about yesterday. But before we go there, I just want to give you this picture because I think it is a really nice illustration of the very significant complexity that we have in the apparel, footwear, and textile sector. And so what you can see here is the entire network of suppliers, beginning from the left with retailers, brands, agents, and then the tier 1, the finished goods assemblers, etc. upstream, and then it goes further upstreams in the supply chain. And what you can also see, it's actually not a chain, although we call it supply chain, it is actually a network, a supply network. And this shows, the immense the immense complexity that we have to deal with. And now we need to sort this in some way. And what we do, we have our materiality assessment methodology that we have defined. And this you can use when you conduct your risk assessment according to the questions in the BRM. And we talked about that yesterday, but I want to focus now on how this looks like when you do it for your supply chain. So first you define your value chain, or in this case, your supply chain. You define the sustainability impact categories. And in this case, we are focusing on the environmental impact categories. And then we estimate and prioritize the risks depending on likelihood and severity in the manufacturing processes. We look at status, impacts, risks, and opportunities. And for risks, we have different perspectives. We will not go into that detail now. If you work with us on a consulting basis, we would disclose this for you. And then also we have also different perspectives for the opportunities. And all those different segments that we have, we then evaluate on a scale 1, 2, 3. And 1 always means, for example, fully implemented and effective, or that the impact is small, the risk is small, or the opportunity is small. And a 3 means that there is nothing in place. We don't have a management system. We don't have a program for our supply chain, or we don't have a policy for human rights, for example, or that we have a very significant impact, a very significant risk, or a significant opportunity. So the higher the number we get on this scale, the more we should get triggered to take action. And now, how does this then work for the supply chain? Well, here again, yesterday we spoke about the entire value chain for a brand, and here we now speak about the supply chain. So you can see here you have to define your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, etc. And you can also do that for your different product groups. So perhaps you have very specific product groups where the supply chains may look different, so it makes sense, or they may have very different environmental impact, so it might make sense to differentiate for that. And then you can see also here at the top and the bottom, you can see the sustainability impact categories. And in order to do this for the supply chain, you also need to go and have a look at what are the actual manufacturing processes that I am dealing with here. And it could look like this. You see here several of the typical manufacturing processes that we have in the textile sector. So spinning, weaving, knitting, dyeing, etc. And of course, there are many more than this, but those are just a few good examples. And now, if you consider each and every manufacturing process will have its own environmental profile. And if we take here the dyeing process as one example, of course, we know that the dyeing process is quite an resource intensive process, also where we may use a lot of chemicals and also have accordingly wastewater, etc. And so what you can do is for every manufacturing processes, you look at what are the inputs I have here. And in this case, we have the energy, water, materials, the fabric itself, the chemicals, and then the outputs, wastewater, greenhouse gas emissions, other air emissions. We may have heat as well. We may have, as a risk, soil and groundwater contamination, hazardous chemicals as well coming out of the process. And then if we go down here, we look at what are the environmental health and safety risks. And obviously today we are really focusing on the environmental risk, but very often you will know that health and safety risks are very much linked to the environmental risks. So, and you see the long list here that we have identified. So the chemicals, inhalation of chemicals in the wastewater, fumes, noise and dust, etc. And then as the last, as the last section here, we can also begin to define our measures. So this is really a good way of looking at the different manufacturing processes. And in the environmental area, it's really a bit different than in the social and labor area, because in the social and labor area, except for health and safety that I already mentioned here, but the other categories that we may be looking at, they are not really dependent on the actual manufacturing process. But of course, in the environmental area, everything regarding impacts, risks, and opportunities are related to how your building looks like, and then according to your manufacturing processes. So this is a very helpful way to think about your supply chain and how you need to drill into your supply chain and understand what is happening here in order to really be able to do an assessment. If you don't do this, it stays very, very high level, and it may be really difficult to also design a good program after you have done the assessment. And now, remember yesterday we talked about the assessment that we do then in a detailed Excel table, and then we summarize the results into what we call a hotspot view. And here you see an example now for the supply chain, very simple, but I think you understand the approach. We have here on the left-hand side, we have some of the environmental impact categories that are important. We see also we have, in this case, just selected apparel tier 1 and apparel tier 2. And obviously, depending on the product groups you have, perhaps you have handbags, for example, perhaps you want to include tier 3, even tier 4. And so you can build out this table accordingly. And then to summarize, we look at only risks and opportunities. And you can see the color coding, the legend here on the right-hand side. If we have significant risks, we also have a dark orange color. For medium impacts and risks, we have a lighter orange color, and accordingly for opportunities, we have a dark green for significant opportunities and the light green for medium opportunities. And the white fields here, they are less relevant, or they may be relevant, but the impact or the risk or the opportunity is rather small. So this is how you, again, similar to what we talked about yesterday, from the brand perspective here in the supply chain, you can also get the same overview over your supply chain. And now let's actually also turn to question number 12 and have a look at what question number 12 looks like. So again, we are in the brand section, and we are in the supply chain section for environment. And the question number 12 is, does your company have a program aimed at improving environmental performance in the supply chain? And the requirements are to have an established environmental performance program. And then the question comes also, what is included in the program? And we will see that on the next slide. And then you also need to give the information on which supply chain segments that you have included here. And this is a recurring additional question that you will receive for many of the other questions as well. So BRM here always wants to know, are you including agents? If that is relevant for you, perhaps you are not working with agents, perhaps you are. Are you including your tier 1, your tier 2, your tier 3, and even tier 4? And always with a question, do you include less than 25%, between 25 and 75%, and or more than 75%? So this is a recurring follow-up questions. They always want to know for many of those questions where what is the coverage you have in your supply chain. And now let's look at what can be included in the program and what SAC is asking about. So they ask about, do you have a corporate policy that is approved by your company's executive team and or board, and also underpins the commitment to the success of the program? Are you in compliance with all applicable regulations or international norms? Do you meet specific minimum requirements and best practices that go above and beyond applicable regulations? So obviously we expect that you will always ensure that your supply chain is compliant to regulations at the very minimum, according to local regulations, of course, but we would also like to see best practices and going beyond. And then, do you have accordingly the requirements documented in the manufacturer contracts that require the suppliers and subcontractors to meet the goals of this program? And then also, do you have public disclosure, including, for example, a description of your impact, effectiveness of managing impacts, and details pertaining to your program? And for those of you who have read a few sustainability reports, you are well aware that very seldom in the sustainability report you can read a good and strong and comprehensive description of the impacts, risks, and opportunities in the supply chain, but actually also usually we are lacking the same description for the value chain. And then how does your company implement the program? And then the possible actions are action plans that are designed to address the differences in manufacturers' priorities, also based on local context, personalized and custom training or workshops, company facilities and facilitates and provides support to manufacturers. And there is another question about this as well later. Collaborative projects which match the manufacturer's environmental roadmap and priorities. Company provides support to manufacturers to develop competencies. And company provides support to manufacturers to engage with stakeholders, and then also supporting innovation. And I think that there are those questions are really very challenging. You need to understand that to be able to run such a very comprehensive program in tier 1 to tier 4 is very, very challenging, and nobody would expect that you would be able to respond yes to all of those questions. And one thing I also wanted to mention is that when you look at the question here, what is included in the program and how does your company implement the program? You will see that in many of the questions in BRM, where you have a similar main question, you will also have very similar follow-up questions. So although the number of questions in the Higg BRM is really immense, there is a system in it. So there is a systematic structure and there is a regularity in the questions. And now let's move over and have a look at how to build your supply chain strategy. And I want to cover a few of the certification systems or programs that are available for you to choose from. And there are, of course, a lot of different guidance documents and certification systems and programs. And one important is the guidance for responsible supply chains in the garment and footwear sector. This is an OECD document, and it should be named due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains. And we talked about due diligence yesterday as well. And then we have BlueSign, which is a program focusing very much on resource efficiency and on chemistry, on positive chemistry in the supply chain. Then we have the Oekotex portfolio. Oekotex has several different standards and certifications. Standard 100 is basically like an RSL certification that ensures that there are no harmful chemicals on the final product. And then we have the STEP certification, which is a certification for the factory, and it covers environment, social, but also some quality questions. And then finally, the Made in Green, which is actually a product label, which includes a combination of the STEP certification for both Tier 1 and Tier 2. It always has to include Tier 2 as well, and the standard 100. So it's quite a comprehensive certification. And then we have the AMFORI and the Business and Environmental Performance Initiative, which is very similar to the Higg FEM. And we have the Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals program with focus on chemicals. But ZDHC has also expanded a bit to cover wastewater and also air emissions as well, since those are two important pathways for chemicals from the processes. Then we have the Apparel Impact Institute. It's a sister organization of SAC, was founded by SAC. And Apparel Impact Institute supports several different programs in the supply chain to improve the performance in the supply chain. And I have one example a bit later from Apparel Impact Institute. And finally, of course, we have the Higg Index, which includes not only the BRM, but as many of you will know, also the Higg FEM, for the which is the Facility Environmental Module, and the Higg FSLM or SSCP, which is the Social and Labor Module. And for those of you who are members in SAC, you will probably be working with the Higg FEM, in this case for the environment as well, and be well familiar with the Higg FEM. But also for you, those of you who are not SAC members, it is possible to work with the Higg Index even if you are not a member. There are certain conditions to do that, but there is a possibility to get access to the portal, to the Higg portal, and use the different tools there. And now, so those are some of the programs, but obviously you need a bit more than just run one of those or perhaps a few of those programs. You also need to have a comprehensive plan and strategy. And I have prepared a small sample for you, just a small example of what this could look like. And in this table here, you can see now, and this is basically a similar structure as the materiality assessment structure. So you will find yourself here again. We have the impact categories here with, for example, permits, legal requirements, management systems, and then we have energy, water consumption, and chemicals. So of course, this is not a complete table. And here I have now expanded. So I mentioned that you could expand to other tiers, to other product groups, and I have made it very simple here. I have taken apparel tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and footwear tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And then I have also taken a cotton farm as one example from one of the materials that you might or fabrics that you might be using. And here you can see now how you could build your own program or even your strategy. So let's say we have the end goal of 2025. And then we have said that, okay, for the permits and legal requirements, we have standalone legal compliance audits that we conduct in apparel tier 1 and in footwear tier 1. So with those suppliers that belong to apparel tier 1 and footwear tier 1, but we don't have that in tier 2 and tier 3, and also not on the cotton farm. And then for management systems, let's say we work with Higg FEM, perhaps we work with BPI as well, or only one of them. Perhaps we are even also working with a Made in Green by Oekotex, or whichever program you have. And then you also mark up which tiers you have rolled out this program into. And then, for example, you can also set your goals. So obviously in a strategy, we always want to have measurable goals as well. So you shouldn't just roll out programs without making sure that you also create an impact and create improvements. And therefore, I have just made an example here. Improve the scores then 10% year on year. So this could be a typical example of how you ask your suppliers if they are using the Higg FEM. If they start with 30 as an average score, for example, that they increase their score year by year. If they start with 30, it will be a bit of a slow increase. Perhaps you ask those who have quite a low score to improve even more, for example. Anyway, this is just, a very, very simple example for you. And then regarding management systems at the cotton level, you could also say, okay, we are using BCI, or we are using a combination of BCI and organic, or we are using only organic, or we are using cotton made in Africa, or any other cotton program. And then if we move down here to energy, so let's say that you have at a corporate level, you have defined a science-based target. And if you are a larger company, if you have then when you define your science-based target, you also have to define a science-based target for your scope 3 emissions. And of course, all your suppliers would belong to scope 3. And therefore, I have written here SBT, science-based target. And for apparel tier 1 and tier 2, I have set an average of 20% energy savings. And for footwear tier 1 and tier 2, an average of 15%. And obviously, you need to have, those numbers are really just examples. You need to have a good understanding of what the potential is within your supply chain and within your different tiers and your different product groups. And for water consumption, I have just made the example apparel tier 1. Tier 1, if there are no wet processes in tier 1 in the cut and sew factories, the potential may not be so significant to save water. In tier 2, if there are wet processes, the potential is higher, is more significant, and therefore I have made a differentiation here from 5 and 15% for water. And then finally for chemicals, I have said, yes, specifically, you would roll out a ZDHC MRSL program, perhaps a Blue Sign program in apparel tier 2, and in footwear tier 2, you would roll out your ZDHC MRSL or your own MRSL if that is what you have. But of course, for chemicals, you still have the coverage of the Higg FEM or any of those other certifications, because if they cover apparel tier 1, and the Higg FEM, of course, covers chemicals management, BPI does as well, Made in Green does too. So you already have a certain coverage regarding chemicals management at apparel tier 1, tier 3, footwear tier 1, etc. So of course, this is not a finished strategy, but I think you get the idea. And this also gives you the possibility to really match when you know where are my risks and where are my opportunities. You can basically make sure that your program links into the main risks and to the main opportunities. All right. Good. And then let's move on. So now with the next question, means of confirmation for suppliers. The question is, does your company have a means to confirm that suppliers at each tier of its value chain identify, manage, and meet compliance with all applicable environmental regulations in their country or region? And again, you should then per tier indicate 25%, 25 to 75%, and more than 75%. And the requirements are that you have to have some monitoring system to verify the suppliers and their suppliers compliance with local law. And that is, for example, if we go back and have a look at our program here, you have for tier 1 apparel and for tier 1 footwear, you have a standalone audit, a legal compliance audit. So there you have really strong means. And for the other tiers, you have, in this case, let's say the Higg FEM, where we know that we have several questions related to having an operating license, and also to have the applicable permits available. But it doesn't include a regular compliance audit, really. So it doesn't include a one-to-one where you really check each and every legislation that is applicable to the factory and the compliance to that. So you would need to respond here accordingly as well. And then the next question is about consultation of manufacturers. And so the question is, were your manufacturers consulted when creating the environmental performance program? And here you should again respond by tier and percent. So similarly to question 12 and 13. And here you can then, there is a follow-up question asking what type of manufacturer engagement. You should also explain more about the relevant supply chain segments and the frequency of feedback that you get, and also how often you update the program based on the feedback. So you may have a regular conversation with your suppliers. You may also have summits with your suppliers where you collect information from them. Perhaps some of your core suppliers are sitting on a council where you regularly have a conversation, a meeting with them about your program. So it should really also be a possibility for the suppliers to give input to the programs that you are suggesting or that you are running. And then the next question is about the action plan. Oh, sorry. And the question is, does your company have an action plan to improve the environmental performance of its supply chain? And you should upload the action plan and the information on addressed supply chain segments again, including the percentage. So it's really throughout, whenever we speak here about the supply chain, about those questions, you need to indicate which tier and which percentage coverage you have. And of course, the action plan is really a detailed plan based on your program. So in question 12, we had the question about the program. And here now, what we want to see is a really detailed action plan. And there is a template available in the How to Higg for this, a standard template. But it is also quite similar to the action plan that we would see in the Higg FEM, where you are asked to, for every goal and target and program you have, to line up what are the specific actions I'm taking, what are the deadlines for that, who is responsible, what budget do I need for that, and when am I going to follow up, and how am I doing in this. And one thing I really want to encourage you to do is don't do just annual check-ins. We see that from time to time that brands, but also manufacturers set up a program, and then towards the end of the year, they check, are we meeting our targets? But of course, you should do that more regularly, perhaps monthly or quarterly, in order to make sure that you can also correct your path if you need to do that, if you're not meeting your targets, that you can really correct it and make sure that you still can meet it then towards the end of the year. And so what about the implementation? Well, there is a question about that as well. And now it's getting a bit more complex because there are actually two important questions about the implementation. And the first one here is the question about reduction of resource consumption. Has your company implemented practices to reduce resource consumption in key impact areas in its supply chain? And what we are looking at here is energy, renewable energy, and water. So this is really with focus on these three areas. And for example, if you are rolling out the Higg FEM, that is of course one really good step. And if we looked at, if you remember the table I showed with an example of a strategy, we had there savings of energy as a goal, and we had savings of water as a goal as well. We didn't have anything about renewable energy. So perhaps you would like to add that as well. And I want to also to point you to one really, really strong resource here, and that is, you see the picture here to the right. This is the NRDC's 10 best practices for textile mills to save money and reduce pollution. It's a very strong document with a lot of very technical examples and also with the calculation and best practice examples regarding payback times. So it's a very valuable document. And we were speaking about the Apparel Impact Institute. And actually, this program that was born by or was developed by NRDC is now owned by the Apparel Impact Institute. And yes, so I can only encourage you, of course, especially if you have wet processes in your manufacturing, to have a look at this resource. There are also a few other resources from NRDC, and obviously also if you're interested in joining a program where you can get support for this, you can also join the Apparel Impact Institute program, which is today then called Clean by Design. So many different names for the same baby. All right. And now it gets very, very complicated. And this is the question about reduction and mitigation of risks. Has your company implemented practices to reduce or mitigate risks in key impact areas in its supply chain? And here we are talking about chemicals and wastewater risks. And we could actually spend one webinar, perhaps even two, to speak about only this question and all the different sub-questions that are in there within this section. It's a very, very long question with a lot of also additional information, and we will not be able to go into any depth here. But I will just give you a small summary of what the different requirements are. And then you can imagine for every requirement, there is probably at least one page and perhaps one additional document and perhaps a few additional resources that you can go and study as well. So one requirement is the communication of expectation to suppliers regarding chemicals and wastewater risks. Then the information again on addressed supply chain segments. So it's the same that we had before with the tier and the percentage. And then what type of program have you established, the frequency of updates, and the frequency of feedback requests. And it goes on. You also need to make sure that you have a confirmation that suppliers identify, manage, and meet compliance, specifically now to chemicals management and to wastewater. But if you have done that well related to the previous questions, then you will be able to do that here as well. And you need a goals and action plan. You need also to have follow-up and monitoring in order to measure the effectiveness of your program. You need to have an escalation process if it doesn't work well, and also if you have problems with your manufacturing sites, they are not meeting the goals, what are you doing there then? You need also to have a complaint mechanism, an RSL and an MRSL. So remember, the RSL is the restricted substances list about the potentially harmful chemicals on the final product, and the MRSL is the manufacturing restricted substances list that covers the chemicals that you are using in the actual manufacturing process. They have, of course, a connection between them, but also not a complete connection because, as you know, there are lots of reactions taking place in the textile and garment industry that may make a chemical that you put into the process may not come out that same way out of the process. And then also, do you have collaboration programs? And you also are asked about your implementation and demonstrated improvements. So this question is very, very comprehensive and requires a lot for you, from you. And then actually the final question that we want to cover today, and that is the question, does your company coordinate and fund environmental performance improvement projects for manufacturers in collaboration with other companies? Again, you will respond which portion of your supply chain, which tiers, and also No, sorry, this is not. This is actually one question where you shouldn't, where you don't need to respond like that. But you should, if you have 76 to 100% of your suppliers have received funding to access one of the environmental improvement projects, then you can respond yes. And you can respond with a partial yes if you have 26 to 75%, and otherwise you should respond no. So this is also quite a challenging question. So such collaboration projects could, of course, be the Apparel Impact Institute that we already spoke about. It could also be, for example, the STWI, the Sweden Textile Water Institute, or there are several other projects that may be available. Perhaps specific chemicals management audit projects, or some support that you do in relation to the Higg FEM or in relation to any of the Oecotex projects. So there are lots, of course, there are lots of different collaborative projects around that you can support and fund then. And with that, let's move over to just a brief sales point. So we would, of course, be happy to support you with the BRM, but also with the Higg FEM and the FSLM. We are a verifying body and have a lot of verifiers globally for both Higg FEM and the FSLM. But we also support brands and manufacturing entities with materiality assessment, strategy development. We also support with handbooks and guidelines, with goals and action plans, and of course also with webinars and trainings. And here you can see an overview of our services. So the materiality assessment and strategies, materials and products, supply chain, and then workshops and trainings. And a small call out for our next webinars. So this is the second webinar in the BRM series. We have another 2 to go. Next week on May 11th, we will be speaking about the supply chain management with the focus on social performance. And then 1 week later, we will be speaking about operations and logistics with focus on the environmental side. And finally, last week, we had a webinar about the upcoming European Union and German supply chain laws. And if you would like to listen to them, you can go and click on this link once you receive this presentation. And here you can register for those 2 next webinars as well. And now I would like to let you also tell us about your questions. And I'm looking here. Yes, there is a question if you will receive the presentation afterwards. And yes, for the webinar yesterday and for today as well, if you register, you will receive the presentation and the recording afterwards. And then somebody asked me to explain the difference between RSL and MRSL. Yes, I'm happy to do that. So historically, the RSL, restricted substances list, have been used actually for quite a long time, perhaps 20, 25 years. And the RSL, they contain a long list of chemicals and limits, and those limits may not be exceeded on the final product. So the RSL manages which chemicals may not be used, may not be present on the final product. And the testing is either done on the final product, or very often it is done on the fabrics before it goes into the cut and sew step. And the MRSL is actually 10 years old by now, so was invented in connection actually with the Greenpeace detox campaign and the establishment of the zero discharge of hazardous chemicals. So with the RSL, you focus on the final product, but that doesn't mean that you have full control over the chemicals that are used in the actual factory, in the manufacturing process. And that was a weak point in the RSL, and therefore we developed the concept of the manufacturing restricted substances list. And the manufacturing restricted substances list tells you which chemicals you should not be using in the manufacturing process. So you should not be buying those chemicals. I hope that clarifies your question. All right. Any other questions or remarks, call outs, ideas you have? Yes. Can you explain a little bit on risk associated with footwear industry? Yes, I can do that. So if you remember what we talked about, the different product groups, and we looked at that slide about the dyeing process and the risks there. And this is what we need to do for footwear as well. So you would need to have a look at what are the different manufacturing processes I have in the footwear industry. And then you try to understand for those different manufacturing processes, what is going in, what is going out, what are the environmental risks here. And then you can then summarize the results later. And so, of course, for footwear industries, similarly in tier 1, you don't use so much water, but you might use perhaps more chemicals than what you would be doing in apparel tier 1. So chemicals might be an issue at tier 1 in the footwear industry. In the footwear industry, for example, very often also you're using a lot of very different materials. And so waste may be a problem as well. You have perhaps large volumes of waste, but you can have a lot of waste also in the apparel tier 1. And then I see here now there comes an addition to this question, especially in tannery. Yes. All right. So in the tanneries, you have a very significant energy consumption. So energy and greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of water is used. So water consumption and wastewater also. And wastewater because in the tanneries, usually you use a lot of different chemicals that may be quite harmful. And you have quite complex processes as well. And then, of course, if you use a lot of different potentially harmful chemicals, they may also come out into the air, but of course also into the wastewater. Yes. Okay. So I hope that was at least quite a short answer, perhaps, to that question. And then we have one more question here. Does GOTS, Oekotex, ISO certification, are they helpful for the Higg index? Yes, they certainly are. So if you have one of those certifications, there are several of the sections and also questions that you will where it will be easier for you to use the Higg index. And I'm now thinking especially about the Higg FEM. So for example, the ISO certification, if you are talking about the ISO 14001 certification for the environmental management system, then in the Higg index, there is one section about environmental management system. So if you have an ISO 14001 certificate, you can actually respond with a yes to most of those questions here. And yes, and similarly with Oekotex, you will have several questions that you have also already responded to. And then we have also one other question, what's the best practice regarding reduction of waste? This is a very broad question, and it is really difficult to respond to like that. So you would need to look at what are the specific different waste categories that I have. What is important to think about is that regarding reduction of waste, you can, on the one hand side, you should look at trying to reduce the waste volumes that you have of each and every waste category. You can also look into your processes. Is it possible to reduce the waste that I produce in my different processes? But there is also one other perspective that is important, and that is can I use other waste handling practices? So is it possible to, for example, if you have a lot of waste that goes into landfill, is it possible to use incineration with energy recovery, for example, instead of landfill? So can I improve my waste handling practices as well? Yeah. We also have one question about circularity. And yes, we can help you with implementing circularity practices. And what is important is, of course, that we would look into the specifics of what your factory is doing then. All right. Any more questions? One last question. No? Okay, great. In that case, I would like to thank you so much for joining today. We have a few questions as a follow-up to you. Once you close the webinar window, there will be a few questions, and we would really appreciate if you can respond to them. And in any case, I thank you so much for joining, and I wish you a nice rest of your day. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.